Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So we've been talking about Democratic primaries nationally. Here in New York City, as almost all of you probably know, the left swept 3 contested congressional races in Democratic primaries last month. Claire Valdez won Brooklyn 7th by 20 points. Darializa, Avila, Chevalier knocked off 10-year incumbent Adriano Espaillat in Harlem and parts of the Bronx, Washington Heights, Inwood, and Brad Lander easily beat Dan Goldman in Brownstone, Brooklyn. New York City DSA, the mayor's self-described political home, won 9 out of 10 state legislative races on the same night. Now, narrative. There are those who say these results signal a realignment, that the Democratic machine in New York, as it has been, is dying and something new is replacing it. There are others who say the wins were narrow, the districts were unrepresentative, and the party's establishment still knows what it's doing in terms of winning elections in a larger context. There were really, in a way, 2 contests in New York this June, the primary and then the narrative war over what it proved. And our next guest covers both. With me now is Michael Lange, New York City political analyst and author of the Substack newsletter, The Narrative Wars. He has spent the week since the election going block by block through the precinct data to find out what actually happened. And if you know Michael Lange's work, back in 2025, last year, he predicted the outcome of the mayoral race block by block and then analyzed it that way afterwards. And he did the same thing, predicting sometimes accurately, sometimes not. He openly acknowledges the block by block results in these contested primaries just before primary day this year, and now he's back with his weeks later deep dive and comparing the results to the narrative. So, Michael, always good to have you. Welcome back to WNYC.
Such a pleasure, Brian. Thanks. Great to be here with you.
And the title of your piece is When Narratives Meet Facts. Where do you want to start with that comparison?
I think again, the political establishment on Tuesday, June 23rd kind of had a rough night, right? And I think afterwards, there was an attempt to explain away that rough night with, I think, a narrative war, as I would put it, to kind of discredit some of the Democratic Socialist challengers, the types of coalitions they built, things like that. You saw Hakeem Jeffries kind of resorted to this on MS Now. He said, oh, it was a bunch of higher income districts, things like that. You had the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, also tell CNN that, well, these candidates, they're basically new and they don't really understand the issues of their district, things like that.
And let me just jump in for a sec to say I have two clips that are over a minute each of Jeffries, whose, of course, leadership is now in question with some of these populist victories after November, whether or not Democrats win the majority in the House, right? If they win the majority, it's will he be the Speaker? If they don't win the majority, it's still will he remain as Democratic leader? And when you're done with this answer, I'm going to play a clip of Jeffries from just before primary day, and then the explanation that you're referring to after the results were in. But go ahead and finish the thought.
Right. And I think they were basically trying to wave away some of these results and discredit them. Right. And I think after going through the precinct data, analyzing it top down, front to back, things like that, a lot of what they were saying was not really rooted in the reality of how these races went. Darializa, Avila, Chevalier won Black voters in the 13th congressional district. Claire Valdez won Hispanic voters. It wasn't just that they did well with voters under 50 or college educated voters or white voters or renters, that these were 2 candidates that built very broad coalitions. And also this type of coalition building extended to the progressive and the Democratic Socialist state legislative campaigns and candidates that won their races as well. I mean, we're talking about kind of the decline of political institutions. It wasn't just even in New York City. You had insurgents in Syracuse and in Buffalo win their races against well-established incumbents and local machines as well. So this was a broad anti-incumbent sentiment, but it was also the candidates who won were not building these narrow coalitions that could only be indexed to a handful of constituencies.
So here's a clip of Jeffries from just before New York primary day, seeming to back all the wrong horses. And note the shot he takes at the end of this clip at the electorate in the Brooklyn and Queens district that nominated Claire Valdez, the DSA candidate there. That very specific shot is going to come at the end of this clip. Listen.
Well, there are 4 races in New York City, and I'm standing behind every single one of those races that involve an incumbent, of course, and that's Adriano Espaillat, Dan Goldman, Yvette Clarke, and Grace Meng. And then we're watching closely 2 open seat races that House Democratic leadership hasn't gotten involved in by custom. And that, of course, is in the 7th Congressional District, where Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez and a coalition of very progressive Democrats, including Tish James, the Attorney General, and the public advocate, Jumaane Williams, along with the Working Families Party and many of the unions that we work closely with, are on one side of that race, with DSA on the other. We'll see what happens. That is the most gentrified district in the nation.
That goes right to your analysis, doesn't it, Michael? He called that Brooklyn Queens district the most gentrified district in the nation, almost by way of saying, hey, where the socialists win, it's because of well-off white people.
Right. It was kind of a pre-planted excuse. And I think, to be very clear, the 7th District has experienced a lot of gentrification, particularly in the 21st century. You know, you compare kind of the neighborhoods and in the class and ethnic character of 2026 there compared to the 1990s or the early 2000s, it is a marked shift. But my counter would be that Claire Valdez does not win by 20 points if you kind of exclude the Satmar bloc, who block voted for Antonio Reynoso. She won the rest of the district by 35 points. You don't get those types of margins, again, if you're building a very narrow coalition that's indexed to only voters under 50, only folks who are college educated, only folks who are white. You know, I think what was staggering to me is that someone like Antonio Reynoso, who, again, had a lot of progressive support, had, you know, I would say a genuinely very progressive record in some of these election districts and neighborhoods, he was barely outperforming how Andrew Cuomo performed a year prior. You know, I think this was not the scope of the victories here, I think really runs counter to the narrative that Hakeem Jeffries was putting forth, both prior to the election and afterwards.
All right. So here he is after the election on MS Now's The Briefing with Jen Psaki. This is the day after the election, June 24th.
Now, in terms of the races in New York, what's interesting is that it certainly was the case that in some of those districts, which tended to be, you know, higher income, you know, districts in many parts of New York City, there was an outsized focus on issues connected to the Middle East. In other districts, for instance, in the South Bronx, Richie Torres was running against somebody who was heavily critical of Richie Torres's position on Israel, and he won by 50 points. And so, listen, I think at the end of the day, you know, individual congressional districts, the beauty of it all, are made up by a diverse group of people who have a diverse set of perspectives on a wide variety of issues. I think for us as House Democrats, we're just hopeful that everybody recognizes once we get through this primary season that the enemy is Donald Trump and MAGA extremism in terms of trying to bring about the type of America that we all desire, where when you work hard and play by the rules, working class folks can live a comfortable life, an affordable life, and a good life.
Hakeem Jeffries, of course, a Democratic member of Congress from Brooklyn himself, as well as the Democratic leader in the House, on the day after the New York primary. And Michael, he really kind of made three distinct arguments there. The districts were higher income, where the DSA candidates won. The results were really about the Middle East, and Richie Torres, who's been very pro-Israel, winning by 50 points in the South Bronx, it's really South Bronx and parts of the West Bronx, proves the left's reach is limited. Do you want to take them one at a time, since you look block by block? I mean, it is fair to say that all the focus was on the winners in the most contested races, but not all those races became so contested. He mentioned in the first clip Grace Meng and Yvette Clarke, who were more establishment progressives. They didn't have meaningful primary challenges in their district, and neither did Richie Torres, who the left loves to hate. So how do you put it all together?
Right. I mean, again, him kind of hand-waving, the result in the 13th congressional district in particular is like a higher income district. There is no congressional district in America with a higher percentage of renters. It's in the 98th percentile nationwide with respect to poverty. I mean, the 13th district is really kind of in New York, the center of, again, the Black and Hispanic working class, right? And so for Darializa, again, to win there with the spending against her, and also in the manner that she did, winning Harlem, winning Black voters, particularly Black voters under 50, I just don't think that his hand waving it lends itself up to scrutiny. And I would also add that we're talking about how Israel and AIPAC have really kind of defined these races. I mean, think about it, right? Like Brad Lander wins by 33 points basically because he's significantly to the left of the incumbent on that issue. Darializa, again, I kind of had questions throughout this primary in terms of, well, she's very much leaning heavily on SFIAT's ties to AIPAC and things like that, but this is a super working class district. Is she doing enough costs of living, economic populism, kind of similar to what Mamdani did with affordability? But then she wins that race kind of with that as like her number one issue. You also have the 12th congressional district, which is, other than a handful of districts in Florida, has the highest Jewish population in the country. And all those candidates immediately, the entire field from the beginning, swore off any AIPAC money, things like that. They obviously were not, as far to the left on this issue as Lander, as Darializa, as Claire Valdez.
Gerald Nadler seat that he's retiring from, right? Which Michael Lasher, who was a more establishment candidate, did win.
Right. But again, the kind of the pro-Israel politics of it all is not exactly why he won. And even again, amongst those candidates with a more liberal, technocratic, Zionist electorate, even those folks all swore off AIPAC and knew it was a losing issue. And again, I'm not here to say that Richie Torres is particularly vulnerable in 2028. I also think the congressional district lines are going to change. But again, Jeffrey's holding up Richie Torres because he defeated a not well-funded challenger who had almost no broad or institutional support as like proof that his kind of faction in the party ultimately did triumph on June 23rd, I think is pretty thin and doesn't really hold up because, again, the left broadly did quite well in the most contested salient races across the city.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey in public radio and live streaming at WNYC.org at 11 o'clock. Bing with Michael Lange, who writes the Narrative Wars Substack and looks at New York City electoral results block by block. Let's take a phone call, and others haven't given the phone number yet in this segment, but I know a lot of you know it by now. 212-433 WNYC. Call or text 212-433-9692. And Jack in Manhattan has done just that. Hi, Jack. You're on WNYC with Michael Lange.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. I've worked in a lot of campaigns as a grunt and running some of them. And what you always want to do is have the opposition people who are voting not vote and you want your voters to vote. So it doesn't matter about turnout. We don't care about democracy. So, however, is that the problem here for left, right, or center, and it really doesn't matter the politics, is that people do not vote in primaries. And Nazi Germany is a really good example of what happens when people stop voting. And so is that you get these extreme candidates who are totally incompetent or insane or corrupt or have very bad policies that are racist, no matter whether they're left or right, winning. Is that when you have 5 or 10% of the population of one little party electing a candidate, and whether it's Adams or Mamdani, is that you get really bad candidates. And our democracy is going to end unless either the primary system ends or that we have a simple rule that says that unless an election has a 50% turnout, it's not valid, and it's top candidates.
Jack, I'm going to leave it there. You painted with a very broad brush, let me say, about people who are extreme, and then do they really turn out to be bad at their jobs necessarily? But he makes a fundamental, I think he raises a legitimate fundamental issue about turnout, because I think something that's gotten very little reporting, Michael, and correct me if I'm remembering it wrong, but wasn't the turnout in this primary something like 5% of registered Democrats?
I think part of that number, and again, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but part of that is because there was no competitive, really top of the ticket race. I think turnout across the city broadly looks different if there's, a competitive gubernatorial election, things like that. But I do appreciate Jack's point in the sense that I think I can rebut it decently well. There's been a lot of posturing that, the socialists or the progressives only won because of lower turnout. But I do think that last year, Zohran Mamdani won the highest turnout Democratic primary in 36 years, over 1 million people voted in the primary. He won the highest turnout general election for a mayoral in 56 years. He got over 1 million raw votes. And New York, look, it's not like other countries where you're mandated to vote and you get fined by the government if you don't, but a very high percentage of eligible citizens are registered to vote. I think it's close to 90%. There are over 5 million people registered with either a political party or as independents in the city. So we do make it quite easy to vote. There's all this early voting as well. And I think while the turnout in these specific congressional districts was around half of what it was in last year's really high salient, high attention Democratic primary, that's still much higher than we've been getting in primaries in the past. And I think it was interesting that, again, there was a question of, will these young people participate, at least proportionally compared to how they participated last year? And the answer was yes. So I don't really think that this is an issue of high turnout, lower turnout, the socialists, mobilizing a small base and winning these lower turnout elections, because they just did this, for some of the highest turnout elections in our city's history last year. So I do think that it's part of a broader political shift, and this is not an aberration.
And, there's also the question of who's motivated to turn out when there isn't a mayoral election at the top of the ticket or a presidential election at the top of the ticket. The people who are the most motivated, which, in the caller Jack's telling would be the people who are most extreme in any direction, but the people who are the most motivated are the ones who show up. Frankly, it's like callers and texters to the show. I always say when we're taking calls, this is a thoroughly unscientific sample, because the people who bother to call a talk show and wait on hold and everything like that, or even pick up their phones and send a text, which is a lower bar, are the people who are most motivated or who feel the strongest on whatever the issue is. Our political reporter, Bridget Bergen, wrote a piece on the turnout. We just pulled it up as this came up, and the headline was, "Voter data shows lower turnout, but pockets of engagement boosted insurgent candidates." So I think that would back up that thought. And she wrote in that article, a total of 531,000 New Yorkers voted in this year's primary, according to data from the New York City Board of Elections. That's a turnout rate of 1 in 6 registered Democratic voters. So that's a little better than the 5% that I cited, but that would be about 16%, still really low compared to 100%. And she wrote roughly the same total number of voters as the June 2022 midterm primaries. So I don't know. One more thought on that before we move to another aspect?
Yeah, I just think that, if we're then all of these primary victors are illegitimate if we're going to talk about, there's lower turnout, because it's like, well, like for a Democratic primary in New York, getting 30% plus turnout is considered good, So I think, again, relative to expectations, the turnout this year was actually pretty solid. And I don't think that, given what happened last year, given what happened this year, that this is a case of, again, like a small, very left-wing extreme part of the Democratic Party hijacking it at all,
Right. I guess the question that the caller raises is, do these candidates, no matter what their politics, represent the people in the district and what they all thought, as opposed to the voters in the district who are a self-selected group? Somebody writes, I'm curious why the DSA didn't endorse in the Richie Torres race. Do you know?
I mean, I think DSA prides, supporting people who are members of the organization, who participate in the internal democracy, things like that. And I don't think that Michael Blake, I don't know if he's a DSA member. He might be, but I don't, it's not, quite like that, I think. And he also ran for mayor last year. He's run for office before, not seeking DSA support, things like that. I think DSA, they're very, for good reason, I would add, protective of kind of who they endorse. It's not just because you're a challenger to Richie Torres and there's certain alignment on some political issues, it doesn't mean that you're kind of entitled to an endorsement, things like that. So
Daniel in Hudson Heights on the Chevalier Espaillat race. Daniel, you're on WNYC with Michael Lange from the Narrative Wars Substack. Hey there.
Yeah, hi. My problem with the whole analysis of the Espaillat race was that I've been here for 25 years, we were looking for a better candidate, a better person than Espaillat. Espaillat was always missing. You couldn't get in touch with his office. His office here is mainly closed. Oddly enough, it was open the other day, but it's always been closed. He had no real big policies other than fighting for immigration, and when he sent out all his flyers, all he talked about was community, and he purposely meant his community. And when you saw Chevalier send out her stuff, she showed a plethora of broad-based people that she was looking for, and her first main thing when I saw her speak was about affordability. And yes, she said, I want money for babies and not bombs, about Israel. And she kept going and saying, we need to get rid of the ICE people who are coming around and doing horrible things. And that was her stance, but it was mainly affordability in the beginning, and that's what she said. And it wasn't this pure Gazan Palestinian problem that she was preaching about. And I know how she felt on that. And Espaillat, we were looking for someone to replace him, and we got it. And she won hands down. So that's all I wanted to say. Okay?
Daniel, thank you for that. And I will say, just as an anecdote, that a friend of mine who lives in Hamilton Heights, that part of the district, told me recently after the election that people in that neighborhood who had a particular issue that was relevant to a few blocks there, I'm not going to get into it and call them out, but they were looking for Espaillat to get involved in this issue that was affecting one of the roadways in that community, and he was just never responsive. So that's, just another anecdote that sort of backs up one of the things that caller was saying. But you in your writing, Michael, pointed to something fascinating in that district. In the Harlem data specifically, Avila Chevalier won young black voters decisively, but basically fought Espaillat to a draw with older black voters. I know you mentioned that before. Generational splits were so important in all these races. And you're right, not only generation, but housing explains this, that Harlem is a supermajority renter neighborhood. So how is that different from places like Southeast Queens or Canarsie, which you describe as the homeowner belt, in terms of how it may have affected this race?
Yeah, I mean, I think how well Darializa performed with Black voters in Harlem, it's like an extension of the Mamdani coalition last year. Mamdani did quite well, again, in Harlem, but also in places like central Brooklyn among Black voters, because these were younger-ish and also supermajority renter areas. And Mamdani across the city with every demographic group, he did best with renters, again, people who are really, not that homeowners are not feeling the affordability squeeze, but like his campaign messaging, again, particularly to rent stabilized tenants as well, was very much geared towards those who give a check to a landlord every month, as he would say. And whereas in, again, the homeowner belt, Southeast Queens, Canarsie, places like that, the electorate is just naturally older, but again, they're also homeowners, and there was a huge kind of class and housing component to his coalition as well, which was, again, always kind of part of the more bullish case for Darializa to do well in Harlem, is that, well, the electorate from an age perspective is pretty well distributed. And also these are the folks really feeling the affordability crunch, which again is something that she speaks to, something that Mamdani speaks to. And that is particularly, again, in amongst the Black electorate, that the housing component is one of the biggest sources of kind of polarization, in addition, of course, to age, as you mentioned.
All right. Well, of course, there's a lot more that we could say since Michael looked at the election results block by block in New York City, literally. But there's a 2 weeks later take from Michael Lange, New York City political analyst and writer of the Substack newsletter, The Narrative Wars. We always learn when you come on. Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure. Pleasure as always. Take care, Brian.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.